I don't own the rights to this music.
The flames lick at my feet. Their hearts full of hate. What they don't understand, they condemn. What they can't comprehend must meet its end. But I won't scream, won't give them that satisfaction. No, I won't confess my false interaction. As I breathe deep and prepare for my passing, I hear that chest burn the witch. I stand accused of being with Satan. No proof for their false accusation. Tied to the stake, no hope of escape. I stand alone and embrace my fiery fate. But I won't escape, won't give them that satisfaction. No, I won't confess my false interaction. As I breathe deep and prepare for my passing, I hear them chant, burn the witch. Lord, I won't scream, won't give them that satisfaction. I won't confess my false interaction. Now as I breathe deep and prepare for my passing, I hear the chants of the
Maybe. There's a possibility. You never know. There was another one. I wanted to kind of put it in the mood tonight. Since we are reading Scottish. Scottish book. Hope y'all are having a fine evening. Still, Grandad would have liked it. Her thoughts returned to touch briefly on the morning again, but on a less disturbing part. After the man had jumped, Digus had stripped her fast and frantically, the look on his face enough to mute any protest. Scarcely bridled rage had emanated from him, making her think her assailant may have just been granted a more merciful death by jumping. His strong hands had been shaken. She'd never seen someone the wine from her, cleansed and bandaged her wounds, all the while resolutely ignoring her state of undress. The more rigid further. But why the fury? She wondered. Because someone had dared to trespass on his property, messed up his home, a woman inclined to romanticize some emotions for her into it. But Chloe wasn't going to be that fool. With a soft sigh, she opened her eyes slowly to find him staring straight at her. He didn't speak, just looked at her. Shadows, his chiseled face was breathtakingly, savagely masculine. His eyes. She got lost in them for a moment, wondering how she could have ever thought them tiger gold. They were the color of dark whiskey, and filled with some emotion. She stared, something like despair. Despair? Deep breath beneath the coolness and mockery, well hidden beneath the relentless seduction? Was it possible that Diagus McKeltar hurt? Don't read into things, she reminded herself. Face value says the man looks like he wants to kiss you, not give you his babies, Sanders. God, he'd make beautiful babies, though. A primordial, feminine part of her purred. That part of her that still bore the biological imprint from cavewoman days. That was drawn unerringly into the most able warrior and protector. His eyes glittering. He bent his dark head to hers. Oh, he definitely wanted to kiss her. She knew she would turn away, call herself a fool in every language she knew, but it didn't help. The lights were down. Most of the passengers were sleeping. The atmosphere was cozy and intimate, and she wanted to be kissed. What harm was there in a little kiss? Besides, they were on a plane. For heaven's sake, how far could it go? Had she known the answer to that in advance, she would have scrambled across the aisle and sealed tape over her mouth. Duct tape. Several layers. Maybe taped her thighs together for good measure. The moment his lips touched hers, a sultry storm whipped up inside her, and she sizzled with heat lightning. He rubbed his sensual lips over hers, taking it slow, making her feel needy and reckless. Slow wasn't what she wanted. She'd allowed herself to a kiss, but by God, she intended to have it. A real one, with all the trimmings. Lips and tongues and teeth and lots of soft sighs. With a little sound of his. His response was instant and electrifying, whipping her inner storm into a tempest of heat and desire. With a low growl deep in his throat, he fisted his hand in her hair and yanked her head back against the seat, his tongue penetrating deep. She couldn't breathe around it. The kiss he gave her was not meant to seduce. It was meant to mark a woman's soul, and it was working. Dominant, like the man, hungry, demanding. Beckoning forth the secrets, Chloe had harbored hunger every bit as deep as his. He was a dark, seductive shadow, all around. And all around her, and she was drowning in him. In the spicy scent of his leather-clad man, in the sleek, wet glide of his tongue, the strong hands in her hair, and she dare not make all that sound that trembled inside of her. Kiss in absolute silence. In blatant mimicry of sex, and she felt herself getting hopelessly wet just from his kiss. The man had made a woman feel like she was being devoured, eaten up, lap by delicious lap. When he stopped and traced the pad of his thumb over her swollen lips, she panted softly, staring, unable to say a word. He searched her face, clearly liking what he saw in her glazed eyes, the evidence of mind-numbing effect his kisses had on her. With a low, satisfied laugh, he pressed his thumb against her bottom teeth and forced her mouth open, wide, clamped his hands on the side of her face, taking her in an open-mouthed, deep-tongued kiss, stealing the breath from her lungs, then giving it back. Making love to her mouth, letting her know how he would make love to her in all kinds of other places. When she was whimpering against his lips, he drew back, his gaze smoldering. Lifting her jean-clad legs, he pulled them across his own, positioning her so she leaned back against the window, giving him better access. "If you wish me to stop, lass, say it now. I won't ask again." Some other woman would have shaken her head no, because Chloe knew she was supposed to say yes. And it certainly must have been some other woman who slipped her hands around the nape of his neck, beneath his soft black leather jacket and into his hair. It was definitely some other woman who slid them hungrily down his rock-hard chest. He caught them in one of his own and pushed them aside. "Do not touch me, lass. Not now." She shushed her protest by pushing one of his fingers between her lips. He touched her tongue, then traced the outline of her lips. Slowly, he trailed that damp finger down her neck, along the edge of her V-neck sweater, stopping in the valley between her breasts. She watched him, mesmerized. He was so incredibly beautiful, there in the shadows, his sensual lips parted, his eyes narrowed with desire. His breath was warm against the damp path he'd left, teasing nerve endings to fiery life. When his dark gaze fixed on her breasts, her nipples puckered into hard peaks, and her breasts felt swollen and heavy. God, the man was intoxicating. Even his gaze was potent, making her skin sizzle, making her frantic for more. The mere thought of his hot, wet mouth greedy on her nipples made her weak with desire. With a glance so rife with sexual promise that it took her breath away, he tugged the blanket from her waist back up to her neck. Then he slipped his hands beneath the blanket, and Chloe's head dropped limply back against the window, her eyes fluttering closed. Should she stop him? And she would. Soon. Really soon. "Open your eyes, lass. I want to see you watching me when I touch you." A soft command, but command nonetheless. Her lids lifted languorously. She felt as if he was sucking the will out of her with his touch, leaving her leaving her limp and utterly vulnerable to his demands. He slipped his hands beneath her sweater, impatiently unhooked her bra, and bared her breasts, palming them roughly. Oh, yes, she thought. This was what she'd been wanting since the moment she'd seen him. To be naked with him, to feel his hot, big hands branding her bare body and skin. She was melting into a puddle of soft feminine heat in the hands of a master, and she couldn't gather the will to care. He cupped her breasts, kneading and plumping, tugging at her nipples between his fingers. His breath hot against her skin, she ran the tip of his tongue up to her neck, then glided his mouth down over her chin to her lips, taking her in a bruising kiss. Fingers closing on her nipples, pinching lightly, he continued the relentless barrage against her senses until she was helplessly arching her hips up from the seat. Suddenly, he broke the kiss and pulled away. His eyes closed, his jaw tightly clenched. A breath hissed from between his gritted teeth. The sight of him fighting for self-control. The proof of the effect she had on him sent a primitive, erotic thrill through her. The sight of him so aroused that he was in pain beyond arousing. It had been the same effect on her desire for him as gasoline splashed on an open fire. She should stop him. She was helpless to stop him. When he opened his eyes, their gazes collided, and she knew he knew exactly what she was feeling. Lost, on the edge, hanging, in terrible need. He slanted his mouth over her, sucking her tongue deep into his mouth. A tiny convulsive spasm began to shiver inside her, and with it came a dim memory of where they were, on a plane with nearly 100 people around. God, what if she came? God, what if she screamed when she came? Stop, she panted against his lip. Too late, Les. He cupped her intimately between her legs, through her jeans, pressed the heel of his palm hard against her V between her thighs, and she nearly cried out from exquisite pleasure of his touch there, where she was so empty and ached so desperately. His breathing harsh, he moved his hand in perfect rhythm, expertly finding her clit through the fabric of her jeans, using the bump of the inseam to create the perfect friction against it. Oh, the man knew how to touch a woman. Let go, Les. Give it to me now. His husky growl pushed Chloe helplessly over the edge. The noise that may have escaped her then, had he not crushed his mouth hard to hers, would have embarrassed her for perpetuity. Might have awakened the whole damn plane. She fancied it might have caused turbulence. Her cries muffled, Chloe exploded. Helplessly, wantonly lost one of his big hands on her breasts, the other between her legs. She had a complete meltdown, shuddering against him, clamping her legs tight around his hand. He took her cries with his tongue deep in her mouth, muting her, but for a tiny whimpering noise. The pleasure was devastating. It crested and broke in 1,000 shimmering pieces inside of her. Her whole body shuddered, and she had been able to make noise. Well, she have done what she feared and screamed. But he took all that sound, his hot tongue devouring, thrusting deep, stealing her breath. He knew exactly how to touch her to keep the pleasure coming. His hand relentless between her legs, not letting up for a second. And as her first orgasm started to ease, it sort of stuttered and became a second one that sent her right back into a meltdown. He kissed her while the aftershocks trembled through her, demanding kisses at first, tampering to soft, slow kisses as her tremors eased. She clung to him, unable to move, and though she just had a simply stupendous double climax, she ached, hot and wet. She had been sated, and yet in was no way sated, perhaps only finally, fully awakened, irrevocably awakened. Oh God, what have I done? He's addictive. They stayed like that for a long moment, forehead to forehead, both breathing unevenly. Then, with a lingering caress, he withdrew his hand. He was motionless a few moments. Then she heard a sharp intake of breath, a pained groan when he reached down and adjusted himself. She fisted her hands and squeezed her eyes shut, trying not to think about that part of him that he'd just touched. That part that she'd caught a glimpse of when he dropped his towel, just enough to feed her insatiable curiosity. No wonder Catherine said that she was dying without him. There was no way she could not let such a thing happen again. If she permitted even one more kiss today, she'd be in his bed. He was too sexy. She was already far too infatuated with him, and once in his bed, her defenses would come crashing down and she'd lose herself. Why not just toss your heart out the airplane windows, Anders? A small inner voice snapped. You have about as much promise as a safe landing. Daigus McKelter was more man than she could handle. She was a little leaguer, clutching a ratty second-hand mitt, trying to play ball with the pros. Just one good grown ball would knock her on her ass, and the game would move on without her. Neither of them said a word, just sat in the dim shadows of the plane, trying to regain control. Chloe was suddenly afraid that she might never get it back around him. She was dozing again, and Daigus was paging through the third book of the Menomenon, or trying to. He was concentrating as well as any man in acute sexual agony could be expected to. Not at all. He kept seeing Chloe's flushed face, her lips swollen from his kisses, the skin around her mouth chafed from whisker burns. Her lips sleepy sex with desire as she reached her woman's peak and shuddered against him. Twice. Clung to him as if she needed him. He'd held her heavy breasts in his hands. He'd touched her between her thighs. He needed her so desperately that he'd nearly cast a druid spell to fog the minds of the passengers and pushed as far as he would go. He contemplated taking her to the bathroom with him. Only her maiden state had stopped him. He'd not spill Chloe's virgin blood like some barbarian in a 2x2 room with cardboard walls. She'd have gone further had he pressed, might have permitted his hand inside her trousers, and had he gone that far, there would have been no stopping. So he kept his hand safely outside her trousers and settled for releasing one of them. He'd never felt such lust before, though Tuping took the edge off. It was wont to leave him strangely wanting. Touching Chloe made him think there might be some eventual satisfaction he'd never before achieved. In the meantime, he was rock hard and in pain. Still, he brooded. He supposed it was a fair trade-off, for though he was in agony of sexual need, their intimacy had mellowed the fury within him. Where earlier in the penthouse he'd been afraid of what he might do, her kisses had given him back a measure of control. Not much, but enough to work with. In the past, he'd always needed to complete the sexual act to gain respite, but not with Chloe. Merely kissing her, touching her, bringing her pleasure had calmed him, had cleared his mind a bit. He made no pretense to understand the how or why of it. It had worked. He would accept that Chloe would tie him in knots, but preserve some measure of his sanity. What boon her kisses would be on Scottish soil. Oh, the woman had something he needed. His instincts had been right when they said mine. And that started a whole new train of possessive thoughts. Thoughts he could do naught about at the moment. So he took slow, deep breaths and forced his thoughts to the pressing issues at hand. That was to come anon, would require all his wits and will. Once he was in Scotland, he knew the changes would speed up again. Changes he had to find a way to stop. And to do so, he had to face his brother. Justin, it's me, Digus, and I'm sorry I lied, but I'm dark, and I need to use the library. Aye, that would go over well. Justin, I failed. I broke my oath, and you should kill me. No, not that. Not yet. Oh, brother, help me. Would he? Blether in hell, you should have let him die. His da had shouted when, back in the 16th century, Digus had summoned the courage to confide in what he'd done. How? How could I do that? Digus had shouted back. In saving him, you destroyed yourself. Now I've lost both my sons, one to the future and the other to the black arts. No yet, he protested. But the look in his dad's eyes, it had said he'd believed there was no hope. Horrified, Digus had fled through the stones, determined to find a way to save himself. And now he'd come full circle, back, to asking his clan for aid. He hated it. He'd not asked for help, not once in his life. 'Twas not his way. Exhaling sharply, he accepted the scotch he'd requested from the flight attendant, and drowned it in a single swallow. As the heat exploded inside of him, the tightness in his chest first intensified, then eased. What could he say? How to begin? With Gwen, mayhap? She could work her feminine miracles with his brother. God knew she'd been a miracle for Justin. He pondered various ways to approach him, but it was more than he could stand thinking on, so he forced his attention back to the text, needing something tangible to work with. An hour later, just before landing, he paused, hand poised over his notebook. He'd finally found something worthwhile. The only mention he'd yet discovered about the fateful war that had occurred after the Tuatha De Danann had left. Not but a brief paragraph. It spoke of 13 outcast druids, so that was how many were inside of him. It was some heinous punishment they suffered, though it did not elaborate further. Beneath it was a notation that referred to the 5th book of Manannan, as he'd suspected. As if memory served him, the 5th volume was in the Kelter library. Hey, Jake! Chloe mumbled softly in her sleep, drawing his gaze again, reminding him that someone had tried to kill her because of him. He glanced at her bandaged hand, and fierce protectiveness flooded him. He would let nothing harm her ever again. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Chapter 11. Just gonna think about leaving some music in the background real quick. That should be better now, right? It's pretty delayed, isn't it? Okay. All right. So I'm going to try to find some background music real quick. Goodness. It's been a long day. Long day. That should be good. For the second time in as many days, Chloe had the strange and immensely irritating experience of walking down a crowded street with Diagus McKelter. The first time had been in Manhattan yesterday. The same thing happened there. Men got out of his way. Not because he was impolite or barged rudely down the sidewalk. On the contrary, he moved with the sleek grace of a tiger, sure-footed, perhaps a bit predatory, and men instinctively circumvented him, going out of their way to give him wide berth. The women, now they were a different matter. They were very irritating part. They reacted in the same way yesterday. It hadn't bothered her as much. On the contrary. Oh, he moved grace of the time. There you go. I can't have background noise. The same thing as my stream. Anyway. So what do you guys think? They're new. Pretty neat, huh? They'd reacted the same way in New York, but yesterday it hadn't bothered her much. They moved aside, but barely, as if able to resist brushing up against him. Their heads turning twice, 3 times. One woman had shamelessly pressed her breast against his arm in passing. On several occasions, Chloe cast an indignant glance over her shoulder, only to catch several of them ogling his behind. She might be small, but blast it all, she wasn't invincible, walking along at his side with his arm around her, his hand resting on her shoulder. Not that he noticed the rubbernecking going on. He seemed oblivious to his effect on women, probably so used to it that he no longer paid any heed. She longed for such oblivion, because watching so many women eye him hungrily was putting her in a bad mood. She cast more than a few pissed-off looks behind them. The intense intimacy on the plane had stirred dangerously mushy feelings in her. Face it, Xanders, you aren't the kind of girl who can be physically intimate with a man without getting emotionally involved. You're just not wired that way. No kidding, she thought grumpily. She was having territorial feelings. Feelings she couldn't afford. for he'd certainly not evidenced any territorial feelings about her. Fortunately, as she watched women stare at him, irritation was making short work of softer motions. She savored the anger, preferred it to waffling and uncertain emotions. Anger was refreshingly tangible. The moment they'd stepped off the plane in Inverness, he'd grown cool again, preoccupied, businesslike, collecting their luggage, striding briskly to the rental car agency. She had to repeat 3 times that her request that he stop in Inverness for a coffee. She desperately needed after traveling for 15 hours. She wasn't sure to meet about She wasn't about to meet his family in the throes of caffeine withdrawal. After so thoroughly losing control of herself on the plane, his detachment kind of hurt. He kissed her into a stupor, given her first ever climax, then withdrawn in every possible way. She should have known, she brooded. What did you expect, Sanders? A declaration of intimacy just because you let him touch you intimately? Damn it, she knew better than that. The two did not necessarily go together where men were concerned. When they entered Gilly's coffee house, she stood beside him at the counter as he ordered, peeking at his profile. She wondered what he was thinking about. That had changed his mood so completely. The man ran hot and cold. That's a good comparison, she thought. He'll either scald me or freeze me. Either way, it'll hurt. Well, she wasn't about to make the first move. If he wanted to go all reserved and professional, she could too. After all, he hadn't said, "Come with me to Scotland and let's get to know each other." He said, "Come with me to Scotland to help me translate texts. Oh, and I'll try to seduce you too." How many times had Catherine called him? Had all 9 of those messages been from her? That thought jarred her thoroughly back into reality. She'd hate being that kind of woman, pining after a man she couldn't have. I know that feeling. She folded her arms across her chest, stared straight ahead at the menu behind the counter. "I always want you, Chloe lass," he murmured suddenly in a low voice, for her ears only. "There's no moment that I do not want to." Chloe scowled. What was he, a mind reader? Damn him anyway. Arching a brow, she tipped her head back, narrowed her eyes, and gave him a chilly look. Who said I was thinking anything even remotely like that? Do you just think I sit around with nothing better to do than think about you? Nay, of course not. I merely thought to assure you that though my mind seem far away, should you wish my attentions, you only have to say so. I'm fine. I just want some coffee. Mayhap you prefer to spend this eve with me at an inn, rather than going straight to my brother's, he suggested with a seductive smile. Chloe's scowl deepened. One eve is not enough, he teased, though his eyes were distant. Greedy lass. Would you be wishing a week? Get over yourself, McKelter, she muttered. Though the woman out there, she flung her hand towards the street, seemed to think so. I hate to break it to you, but the world does not revolve around you. Diegus's nostrils flared, and he inhaled sharply as he recognized her emotion. Jealousy. She'd been watching other women look at him. Aye, he noticed in a peripheral fashion. There's only one of me. They broke the mold. And it chafed her. And her desire for him was so intense, enough to make her feel jealousy, made him feel wildly possessive. His seduction was working. She was growing attached to him. Abruptly, he pulled her in front of him at the counter, wrapped both his arms around her waist. He held her while their ordering was filled, hungry for the feel of her wee body against his. She was stiff at first, but then slowly the tension quit her small, lushly curved form. When she leaned forward to take her latte and scone, he pressed her from behind, deliberately brushing his hard arousal against her bottom, letting her know exactly how much she was always on his mind. He smiled when she nearly dropped her coffee. "I'd have bought you another," he said with a shrug, and she glanced sharply over her shoulder at him, blushing as furiously as she was scowling. Next gen! Alariel. Alariel. Alariel? Is that how you say your name? That's awesome. Alariel. Alariel. That's pretty, actually. I like that. All right. Like as not, he'd buy her the cafe if she indicated the slightest desire for it. "You're incorrigible," she hissed. "Just so you know, what happened on the plane is not going to happen again," she informed him, before turning and stalking off toward the rental car. His eyes flared dangerously. Did the lass think to share such intimacies with him and then rescind him? Oh, nay. Digus McKelter didn't go backwards. She would find that out soon enough. As they neared their destination, Digus grew increasingly subdued. After lengthy deliberation, he decided that best to simply appear on Justin's doorstep, unannounced, hope Gwen answered the door, then hope for the best. He glanced over at Chloe, acknowledging that he had not have made this trip alone today. Even with her beside him, he considered turning around half a dozen times. Alone, he'd have tried the museums first, then would have put it off indefinitely, telling himself all manner of lies when the simple truth was that he didn't want to face Justin. But somehow, with her at his side, it didn't seem nigh as impossible. Her earlier irritation seemed to have passed, or, as wee as she was, there simply wasn't enough room in her to contain irritation and excited curiosity. She was sipping her coffee, staring out the window, pointing and asking endless questions. What was that ruin? When did the summer begin? When does the heather bloom? Where were the really pine martens? And could she see one? Could they be petted? Did they bite? Could they go to the museums while they were there? How about Glengarry? How much further? He'd been answering absently, when she was so enamored by the vista that she didn't seem to notice his inattention. He had no doubt that she would fall in love with his country. Her enthusiasm made him remember a time that seemed a lifetime ago, when he, too, had viewed the world with such wonder. He forced his gaze away from her, and his thoughts back to the upcoming confrontation. He hadn't seen Justin, awake that is, in 4 years, 1 month, and 12 days. Since the eve of that Justin had been placed in the enchanted sleep to slumber for 5 centuries. They'd spent that final day together trying to wedge a lifetime into it. Twin brothers and best friends, since they'd drawn the breath, a mere 3 minutes apart. They'd said farewell that night, forever. Justin had gone to sleep in the tower that Digus had to walk past a dozen times a day. At first, he bid his brother a sardonic good morrow each morn, but that had swift grown too painful. Hold on. Had to add water to the pot. Sorry. Before Justin had gone to the tower, they labored together over plans for a new castle that was to be Justin and Gwen's home in the future. The quickening? What? After Justin had gone to sleep, Diogus had immersed himself in overseeing the construction of it, directing hundreds of workers, making certain all was perfect, working alongside with the men. And while so involved with the building of it, he'd become aware of an ever-growing restless emptiness inside of him. The castle had begun to consume him. Impossible for a man to labor daily for 3 long years and not lose a part of himself, to not merely the act of creating, but the creation. The empty waiting rooms were the promise of family and love, the promise of a future he'd never been able to envision for himself. When Justin had died, he'd gone and stood outside the castle for hours uncounted, staring at its dark and silent silhouette in the gloaming. He'd imagined Gwen in the future, waiting, and Justin never arriving. She would live alone. Nell had told him Gwen was pregnant, though Gwen herself had not yet realized it, which meant Gwen would raise their babes alone. He imagined no candles ever flickering beyond those windows, no children ever padding up and down those stairs. All the empty places inside him had finally been filled, not with good things, but with anguish, fury, and defiance. He'd shaken his fists at the heavens. He raged and cursed. He'd questioned all he'd been raised to believe. And by the misty crimson leaked dawn, and by the misty crimson streaked dawn, he'd known but one thing. The castle he'd built would be filled with his brother and his family. Aught else was simply unacceptable. And if the legends were true, if the cost was his own chance at life, he deemed it worthwhile. He'd little left to lose. "Hey, are you okay?" Chloe asked. Diogus started, realizing he must have stopped at the stop sign for several minutes. He shook his head, scattered his grim memories. "Aye," he paused, weighing his next words. "Lass, I haven't seen Justin in some time." He had no idea how Justin would react. He wondered if he would know, merely by looking at him, that he was dark. The bond of twins betwixt them was strong. I used the stones, but the legends were wrong. There was no force in between. I'm fine. 'Tis but that this century is a marvel, and I've been exploring a wee. I'll come home anon. 'Twas the lie he'd been telling his brother since the day he'd made the mistake of calling him, unable to resist hearing Justin's voice, so he could assure himself that he was alive and well in the 21st century. "Diogus, you can tell me anything," Justin had said. "There's naught to tell. 'Twas all a myth." Lie upon lie. Then had begun the regular calls from Justin asking when he'd be home. He'd stopped picking up the phone months ago. "So is this a reunion?" There can be only one. Shh. Lightning. Anyway. So is this a reunion? Of sorts. If Justin turned him away, he'd take Chloe to the museums. He'd find another way. He was fair certain his brother wouldn't attack him. If he'd not come home, if he'd made Justin hunt for him, that might have well happened. But he hoped Justin would understand his return for what it was, a request for aid. She eyed him intently. He could feel her gaze, though he kept his profile to her. "Did you and your brother have a falling out?" she said gently. "Of sorts." He released the brake and resumed their journey, giving her a chilly look so she'd drop it. few moments later, she slipped her wee hand into his. He tensed, startled by the gesture. He was accustomed to women reaching for many parts of him. None of them were his hand. He glanced at her, but she was staring straight ahead, yet her hand was in his. He closed his fingers around her before she might snatch it away. Her wee hand was nearly swallowed by his. It meant more to him than kisses, more even than bed play. When women sought him for sex, it was for their pleasure. But Chloe's small hand had been given without taking. Adam Black watched the automobile wind up the roads into the Kelter Mountains. Though his queen had long ago passed an edict forbidding any Tuatha De Danann to go within 1,000 leagues of the Kelter, Adam had decided that since the compact had been violated on the Kelter side, old edicts didn't apply. He knew why she'd passed the edict. The Kelter, having pledged their lives and all their future generations to upholding the compact, were to be free of any Tuatha De Danann interference, because his queen had known even then that there were those among their race that didn't like the compact, who'd not wanted to leave the mortal realm, who'd argued to conquer the human race, who might have tried to goad the Kelter into breaking it. So since that day the compact had been sealed, not one Kelter had so much as glimpsed one of their ancient benefactors. Adam suspected that might have been a mistake. For although the Kelter had faithfully performed their duties over 4,000 years, they'd forgotten their purpose. They no longer even believed in the Tuatha De Danann, nor did they recall the details of the fateful battle that had set them on their course. Their ancient history had come nothing more than vague myths to them. While on Yule, Beltane, Samhain, and Lughnasadad, or whatever, the Kelter had enacted the rites that kept the walls solid between their worlds. They no longer recalled that such was the purpose of those rites, which we're coming up to those, by the way. Some of those. Samhain already passed, but Yule's coming. Perhaps one generation had neglected to pass down the oral tradition in full to text to the next. Perhaps the elder had died before he'd been able to impart all the secrets. Perhaps old texts had not been faithfully recopied before time had disintegrated them. Who knew? One thing Adam did know was that the mortals ever seemed to forget their history. Those days that were so sacred to the compact were now seen as feast days, little more. He snorted, watching the car crest the hill. Humans couldn't even get out of their own religious history sorted out from mere 2 millennia past. It was no wonder that their history with his race had become so obscure by time's passage. So, he thought, watching from his perch upon high, the darkest druid has come home, bringing with him all the resurrected evil of the Dragar. Fascinating. He wondered what his queen would make of it. He had no plans to tell her. After all, in Adam's opinion, it was her fault that they'd been there to resurrect in the first place. Even now, she was ensconced with her council, where they were busy determining the mortal's fate. 4,000 and some odd years ago, his people had withdrawn to their hidden places so that mortal and fey would not destroy each other. Shortly thereafter, the Dragar, with their black arts, had nearly destroyed both of their worlds. His queen would never permit such a thing to happen. He sighed. The mortal's time was finite. Chapter 12. We're just scooting along tonight, ain't we? Gwen McKelter, former preeminent theoretical physicist, was now wife and expectant mother. Sighed dreamily, leaning against the bathtub, against her husband's hard chest. She was between his muscular thighs and with his strong arms around her, soaking in warm, bubbly water and deliriously content. Poor man, she thought, smiling. In her second trimester, she'd nearly punched him if he tried to touch her. Now, in her third, she was inclined to punch him if he didn't touch her. Frequently and exactly how she wanted. Her hormones were all over the place, and darn things would just function according to what the equation she had been able to compute. But Justin appeared to have forgiven her for the last few months, after the marathon sessions that they'd been having. Not only didn't he seem to care that he was hopelessly fat, but he'd happily devoted himself to finding new and unusual ways to make love that compensated for their physical changes. Okay. The tub was one of Gwen's favorites. Hence, there she was at 7 o'clock in the evening, with dozens of candles scattered around the bathroom, and her husband's strong arms around her, when the doorbell chimes downstairs. Justin dropped a kiss on the nape of her neck. "Are we expecting someone?" he asked, the small kiss turning into delicious nibbles. Not that I know of." "Farley, would you get the door?" Farley, properly christened Ian Lewin McFarley, was their butler, and every time Gwen thought of him and her heart went all soft. The man had to be 80 if a day, and bristly white hair and tall bowed frame. He lied about his age, and everything else, and she adored him. What made her heart go really soft was that Justin also had a tender spot for the old geezer. He had endless patience and invited his tall tales in the evening before fire, as butler and lord shared a wee drink. Never. She knew that regardless of how well her husband had adapted to her century, part of him would always be a 16th century feudal lord. When they'd first moved into their new home, instead of doing what a normal 21st century person would have done, and taken an ad out in the paper for staff and contracted an employment agency, Justin had gone to Alberath and dropped word in the local grocery and barber shop. Within 2 hours, Farley had appeared on their doorstep, claiming to have buttled in some of the finest homes in England. The man had never been out of Scotland, and further claimed he would arrange the entire staffing of their castle. That's a lot. "Hey, Daniel. How are you? Missed you last night." That sounded like I don't even know what. Sounded like something out of Harry Potter. "Missed you last night." Long 36 hours, I bet. They'd since been overrun by McFarleys. There were McFarleys in the kitchen, McFarleys in the stables, McFarleys doing the ironing and the laundry and the dusting. As near as Gwen had been able to count, they employed the man's entire clan of 9 children and spouses, 14 grandchildren, and she suspected there were a few greats floating about. And though it had soon become clear that none of them had any experience in their respective positions, Justin had pronounced them all satisfactory because he heard in the village that positions were hard to find. In modern terms, the economy in Alberath was not good. Work was hard to find, and the feudal lord had surfaced, taking responsibility for the McCarleys. She adored that about her husband. A sharp knock at the bedroom. Oh my gosh. A sharp knock at the bathroom door jarred her from her thoughts. Why was that so hard to read? Oh, I bet. My lord, Farley inquired cautiously. Gwen giggled and Justin sighed. Farley refused to address him by any other title, no matter how persistently Justin corrected him. Mr. McKelter, Justin muttered. Why is that so difficult for him? He was determined to adopt 21st century customs. Unfortunately, Farley was just as determined to preserve the old ones, and had decided that since Justin was the apparent heir of the castle, he was a lord. Period. The end. Aye, Justin replied more loudly. Sorry to be disturbing you and the lady, but there's a man here to see you, and ken 'tis no of my business. But I'm thinking I should have you know that it seems a bit the dangerous type, though he's polite enough as it is. Now the lass with him, well, in my opinion, she's a sweet wee and proper lass, but him, 'tis no more an air about him. I'm thinking you mightn't hold well to me saying so, being as he looks as much like you, though not like you at all. Ahem. Farley cleared his throat, and Gwen felt Justin go rigid behind her. She'd gone rather tense herself. My lord, he's saying he's your brother, and being as you've no mention of brother, despite the resemblance. Gwen didn't hear another word because Justin shot from the bath so fast that she got a thorough dunking, and her ears were filled with water. By the time she surfaced, Justin was gone. Daigus had neglected to mention that his brother lived in a castle. Sheesh, Chloe thought, shaking her head. I should have expected it. From where else would such a man have come from? Old world indeed. It was an elegant castle, with great stone wall and authentic barbican with round turrets and square towers, and probably 100 rooms or more. Chloe pivoted, trying to look everywhere at once. She'd not uttered a word since they entered the tree-canopied drive and begun their approach. She'd been too stunned. She was in Scotland, and they were going to be staying in a castle. The interior of the great hall was enormous, and with corridors shooting off in all directions. An intricately carved balustrade encircled the hall on the second floor, and an elegant double staircase swept down from the opposing sides, met in the middle, and descended in one wide train of steps. A lovely stained-glass window was inset above the double entry doors. Brilliant tapestries adorned the walls, and floors were scattered with rugs. There were 2 fireplaces in the hall, both tall enough for people to walk around in. Bigger than the bathroom in her efficiency had been. Her fingers curled as she wondered how many artifacts she might get to examine. Do you like it, lass? Daigus asked, watched her intently. It's magnificent. It's... She broke off, sputtering. Oh, thank you, she explained. Do you have any idea how thrilling it is to me to be standing in an authentic medieval castle? I've dreamed of this moment. He smiled faintly. Boy, the castle is magnificent, isn't it? He couldn't have sounded more proud, and he'd built it himself. Chloe thought, did you grow up here? Sort of. I could get tired of that answer in a hurry, she said, her eyes narrowing. I'm not exactly hard to talk to. You should try it. Since he told her that he and his brother had some kind of falling out, she was better able to understand his withdrawal and attitude. But if he thought it would keep her from asking questions, he was wrong. Ooh, castle. I'd like to be in a damn castle. Oh, wait, I am. Yeah, It's not a castle, but it's an estate. Biltmore. I'm so excited. I'm going to be just like her when I go to Biltmore. Oh my god. Oh. I got my dress. Man, it's been hanging here. I got my heels set up. I got my dress. I got some new bling today. Check it out. Bling, 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 bling. Estate ladies always have nice knickers. If they have any at all. I mean, just saying. Ever the curious lass, aren't you? If I waited for you to offer information, I'd never find out anything. Speaking of which, we need to talk about this curse thing soon, too. I can't help you if I don't know exactly what we're looking for. Wariness flickered through his eyes. Aye, I know. Anon, lass. Further now, let's see if I survive the wrath of my bro. He broke off abruptly, his gaze flying to the stairs. Chloe's gaze followed, and she sucked in a sharp breath. A man who looked exactly like Diagus was standing there, halfway down the stairs, looking down at Diagus. She looked between them rapidly, disbelieving. Oh, God! You're twins? She said faintly. Well, that wasn't very faintly, but whatever. She said, faintly because the man at the top of the stairs wore only a towel around his waist. She knows what that looks like. My apologies, lass. And lopped up the stairs 3 at a time. Diagus mumbled something that sounded almost like, if he drops his towel, I'm going to kill him. But Chloe decided he was imagining things. Oh, shit. I'm sorry. These books are like making me like weirdly fascinated with twins now. I don't know. It's odd. The man skidded to a halt at the top and cast a sharp glance directly at Chloe. Do not let him leave, lass, he roared at her. Wow! Was all she could manage. Beside her, she felt Diagus stiffen. For a moment, it seemed the hall grew markedly cooler. The lasses have all said I'm more handsome, he said icily, and a better lover. Chloe blinked up at him. What? So do not be oogling him. He's married, lass. I wasn't oogling, she protested, knowing full well she'd been oogling. And if I was, it's only because you didn't warn me that you were twins. He gave her a dark look. Besides, he only had a towel on. Besides, he only had a towel on. I do not care if he not be but his skin on. 'Tisn't polite to oogle another woman's husband. Chloe caught her breath. His expression was furious, and he looked jealous. About her? For looking at his brother? She peered at him, hardly daring to credit it. Abruptly, his gaze was gone again, fixed at the top of the stairs, and hers followed. She glanced from Justin to Diagus and back again. And she wondered how Diagus might have worried, for even a moment, that Justin wouldn't welcome him home. The expression on his brother's face took her breath away. Love blazed in his eyes. Though she couldn't tell him from the distance, it looked as if they were glistening with tears. Justin, Diagus said with a cool nod. Justin's eyes dimmed and his mouth tightened. Justin? Justin snapped. That's it? A mere Justin? No good morrow, brother? 'Tis sorry that I've been such an ass and not come home? His voice was rising with each word, and he began stalking down the stairs. I'm so confused as to who's who now. God, they even moved the same way, Chloe marveled. Like great sinuous cats, all sleek strength and smoothly sculpted muscles. Though Drustin had pulled on trousers, he'd not bothered with a shirt. His hair was wet, dripping down to his chest. The muscles in his glistening torso rippled with every movement. He must have been in the shower, she realized. Is that how you'll greet me? Drustin was still talking, but she missed part of his verbal barrage, apparently temporarily deafened by visual overload. Get over here and greet me properly, he thundered. Chloe tore her gaze away from Drustin and looked at Daigus, and stared. Though he looked as remote and impassive as ever, his eyes positively burned with emotion. He was as still as one of many standing stones they've passed, seemingly every bit as ancient and obdurate. If one didn't notice his hands fisted at his sides, and those eyes. Oh, there was more to Daigus McKelter than he let on. Her hypothesis was right. When he felt most deeply was when he exhibited the greatest reserve. So that was how such a man wore love, she realized. Quietly. Not an expressive man. Not a man to laugh or cry or dance. A man who had hair to his waist but never wore it down. Did he never let himself go? I bet he does in bed, she said, utterly rattled by her thoughts of all that disciplined muscle coming undone in bed. God, she could just taste it. Wow, all again. Shit, the funny is fun. I'm getting confused who's who now because I read the first book and I was like prominently on Drustin. Now it's prominently on Daigus, and it's like fucking me up. Oh my arm. What are we at? 113? Okay. She shivered, studying the two men. They were twins, but they weren't completely identical, she realized. There were minute differences. Drustin's hair wasn't as long, a bit past his shoulders, his eyes silvery, taller, and he probably weighed more. Drustin was packed with muscle. Daigus's body was leaner, more ripped. Same beautiful chiseled features, though, even in some dark shadow beard on similar jaws. She peered intently. Daigus's mouth was more full and silky, the mouth of a born seducer. She was so engrossed that she didn't even notice the woman approaching until she spoke softly. Gorgeous, aren't they? Chloe turned, startled. The woman who'd spoken was as short as she was, and extremely pregnant. With silvery blonde hair and wispy fringed bangs, her hair was twisted up in a knot and slightly damp, and Chloe blushed a little, realizing they obviously both been in the shower. And she found it highly doubtful that they'd been in separate ones. She was beautiful, glowing with the unique radiance of a pregnant woman who was utterly thrilled in pending motherhood, or the radiance of a woman who'd just been treated to a McKelter's special seductive talents in the shower. Chloe thought wistfully. The mere thought of taking a shower with Daigus made Chloe feel rather glowy herself. Very. I had no idea they were twins. Daigus didn't tell me. Drustin didn't tell me either. He regretted that later when I kissed Daigus because I thought he was Drustin. Drustin didn't care for it one bit. They're possessive about their women, but I'm sure that you know that. I'm Gwen, by the way, Drustin's wife. Dun, dun, dun. No one tells anyone anything. It's only secrets in this family. Sounds the same as mine. There's no twins here.
Sissy was a twin, and I lost the other one. So there are twins in the family. It's just, unfortunately, one's in heaven and one's on earth. So. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Chloe Zanders. Chloe nibbled at her lip uncertainly when it felt necessary to clarify. But I'm not his woman. We met only recently, and I'm just here to help him with translations. Gwen looked highly amused. If you say so. How did you two meet? If you say so. Now, just what did that mean? And how to answer the question about how they met. Chloe opened her mouth and shut it again. Surely not. I swooped through his penthouse and he tied me to his bed, and then I started turning into a person I hardly recognized anymore. That's a long story, she said wearily. Those are the best kind, and I can't wait to hear it. I have a few of my own. Gwen looped her arm through Chloe's and steered her toward the staircase. Farley, she called over her shoulder to the white-haired butler, would you have tea and coffee sent up by the solar? And some snacks. I'm starving. Right away, milady. With a doting look at Gwen, the butler rushed off. Why don't we get to know each other while they catch up? Gwen asked, turning back to Chloe. They've not seen each other in quite some time. Chloe glanced again at Diagus. He and Drustin were still standing in the middle of the great hall, talking intently. Just then, as if he felt her gaze on him, Diagus looked at her, tensed, and started to walk towards her. Surprised by his concern for her at what clearly a difficult moment for him, Chloe shook her head, assuring him wordlessly that she was fine. After a moment's hesitation, he turned back to Drustin. Chloe smiled at Gwen. I'd like that. There's a couple of twins that I'm looking at. Nah. There's no twins in this family. God couldn't handle it to me. He broke the mold. Chapter 13. When the lasses hasted off to the solar, Drustin and Diagus adjourned to the privacy of the library, a spacious, masculine room with cherry bookcases recessed into the panel's walls, comfortable chairs and ottomans, a dusky rose marble fireplace, and a tall bay windows. The library was Drustin's retreat, much as the glass-faced solar that overlooked the gardens was Gwen's. Drustin couldn't take his eyes off his twin brother. He'd nigh given up hope that Diagus would come home. He'd been dreading what he might have to do if his brother didn't. But he was here now, and the tight fists that had been clenched around his heart since the day he read and in a fit of fury burned the letter their dad had left for him, finally, blessedly, eased a bit. Diagus tossed himself into a chair near the fireplace, stretched out his legs, propped his feet up on a stool. What do you think of the castle, Drustin? It appears to have withstood the centuries well. And aye, that it had. The castle had surpassed all of Drustin's expectations. If ever a man had received proof of his brother's love, it had been in the gift of their home. Then Diagus had topped off that gift by sacrificing himself to ensure Drustin would survive to live in it. But Diagus had always been like that, though not a man to whom which soft words came readily. When he loved to a dangerous point. 'Tis both his greatest strength and weakness. Sylvan had oft remarked that truer words had never been uttered. He had the wild, true heart of a child in the body of a jaded man, intensely guarded unless he chose to give it, yet once given. It was given completely, without thought to his own survival. 'Tis even more magnificent than I'd imagined when he worked on the plans, Drustin said. I can't thank you enough, Diagus. Not for this, not for anything. How did one thank a brother for sacrificing his soul for one's own happiness? My life for yours, his brother had chosen. Thanks weren't possible. Diagus shrugged. You drew the sketches. Aye, So he will pretend I meant the only castle and evade deeper issues. Only the castle and evade deeper issues, Justin thought. You built it. Gwen loves it too. And we've now finished having electricity and plumbing installed. There was so much they needed to talk about, and not of it would be easy to address. After a moment's hesitation, Justin decided to confront it directly, for he suspected Diagus would talk in circles around it. Crossing to the liquor cabinet, Justin splashed McCullen into 2 glasses, handed one to Diagus. 35-year-old single malt scotch, only the finest for his brother's return. So how bad is it? He muttered matter-of-factly. Diagus flinched. A small, hastily contained reaction, but there. Then he tossed back the drink in one swallow and handed him the glass for a refill. Justin complied, waiting. His brother sipped more slowly at the second one. Worse now that I'm back on Scottish soil, he said finally. When did your eyes change? It wasn't only his eyes that had changed. Diagus moved differently. His most minute gestures were carefully executed, as if he could contain what was in him only by constant vigilance. A tiny muscle leapt in Diagus's jaw. How dark are they? They're not gold anymore. A strange color, nigh like your drink. They change when it starts to get bad. When I've used too much magic. What are you using magic for? Justin asked carefully. Diagus tossed back the rest of his drink, rose, and went to stand before the fire. I was using it to obtain the text I needed to see if there was a way to get rid of them. What is it like? Diagus rubbed his jaw, exhaling. 'Tis as if I have a beast inside me, Justin. 'Tis pure power, and I find myself using it without even thinking. When did you know? He asked with a faint, bitter smile. Hey. You there? Yeah. What's up? What time is it? Yeah, I'll be there in about 30 minutes. Why? I thought you were home. Somebody pulled in the driveway earlier. I thought you'd been home. What are you using magic for? Real truth. Oh, lighting candles and tying knots. Oh, where was I? It's making me want to drink too. This is the hard part about being addicted to something, is even years later, you still have cravings for it. What are you using magic for? What is it like? As if I got a boss. 'Tis pure power. I find myself using it without even thinking. When did you know? He asked with a faint, bitter smile. Cold eyes, Justin thought. They hadn't always been cold.
Once they'd been warm, sunny gold, full of easy laughter. I've known since the first, brother. A long silence. Then Diogenes snorted and shook his head. You should have let me die, Diogenes, Justin said softly. Damn you for not letting me die. Thank you for not letting me die, he added silently, torn by emotion. Huh? Nothing's wrong. The Ministry of Magic warns every candle lit is a bit closer to releasing the dark ones. Are you sure? Are you sure? Or do you have to sit in the dark alone with no light to find your way through to the end where one light is? Your soul leads you to it. Trust me when I say this. Oh yeah, when my internet drops out, my screen goes black because it resets. Sorry. That's why God gave us batteries. Yes! For more than one wand. Let's just call it a wand. Swish and flick. I could just see it now. The Harry Potter part. I still gotta go pick up my daughter. Me. Just so you know, I eat Oreos. Plenty. I don't have any milk. Milk. That's how you say it, right? Milk. I always say it wrong. My kids make fun of me because I say milk. Mother trucker. She's not pregnant again, is she? She's pregnant with twins, remember? Wait, who are you talking about? You better not be talking about my daughter. Don't start. I don't want to be a grandma just yet. Let me get to 40 first. At least. I've lasted 6 kids and got to 40. Without being a grandma, I think I did pretty good. I'm talking about the chick in the book. What are you talking about? Cat girl is bipolar. If she got pregnant now, she would lose her fucking shit. She would lose her shit. She wouldn't be able to handle it. Unmedicated too? Oh, hell no. She better fucking not be, for real. I mean, if she is, she is. I know for a fact, and I've raised her right not to have an abortion or nothing. Because I have had one, and I regret it every single day since then. Every fucking day since then. And I tell them about that. I've done a lot of bad shit in my life. And I regret a lot. Anyway. I forgot where I was. It was a terrible mixture of grief and guilt and gratefulness. If not for his brother's sacrifice, he would never have seen his wife again. Gwen would have raised their babies in the 21st century alone. The day he'd read Sylvan's letter and discovered the price his twin had paid to ensure his future, he'd nearly gone crazy. Hating him for giving up his own life, loving him for doing it. Nay, Diogenes said. I should have watched over you more carefully and kept the fire from happening.
'Twas not your fault. Oh, aye, it was. Do you know where I was that eve? I was down in the lowlands in the bed of a lass whose name I can't even recall. He broke off abruptly. How did you know? Did Di warn you? Be right back. I gotta keep adding water to this or else it's gonna burn up. That's the only way I'm able to keep heat in here now. Hopefully this propane tank lasts a good bit. Oh, I forgot to tell you, I got heat in here. Well, I call it heat, but it's a stovetop. Ow! Still getting used to this thing. um... He left a letter for us explaining what had happened, advising that you disappeared. Our descendants, Christopher and his wife, Maggie, whom you'll meet anon, gave it to me shortly after I'd awakened. You called not long after that. Yet you pretended to accept my lies. Why? Justin shrugged. Christopher went to Manhattan twice and watched you. You were doing not what I felt needed to be stopped. His reasons for not going to America to retrieve his brother were complicated. Not only had he been loath to leave Gwen's side while she was pregnant, he'd wary of forcing a confrontation. After talking with him on the phone, he'd known that Diagus was indeed dark, but was holding on somehow. He suspected that there were Diagus a tenth as powerful as Sylvan believed. Trying to force Diagus to return would have accomplished naught. Had it come to force, one of them would have died. Now that Diagus was there in the room with him, Justin knew 'twould have been himself who'd died. The power in Diagus was immense, and he wondered how he withstood it this long. Cautiously, when Diagus turned his back to him and busied himself opening a new bottle of whiskey, Justin reached out with his druid senses, curious to know more about what they are dealing with. He nearly doubled over. The whiskey he'd sipped curdled in his gut and tried to claw its way back up. He retracted instantly, frantically, violently. By Amerigan, how did Diagus stand it? A monstrous, icy, rapacious beast pulsed beneath his skin, shaking through him, coiled, but barely. It had a fierce, gluttonous appetite. It was huge and twisted and suffocating. How could he breathe? Diagus turned, one brow arched, his gaze icy. Never do that again, he warned softly. Without bothering to ask, he poured Justin a refill. Justin snatched it from his hand and tossed it back swiftly. Only after the heat of it had exploded in his chest did he trust himself to speak. He'd not kept his senses open long enough to explore the thing. His throat constricted by whiskey and shock, he said hoarsely, "How did you know I was doing it? I felt you, and so did they. You do not want them to. Leave them alone." "Oi," Justin rasped. He hadn't needed the warning. He had no intention of opening his senses around his brother again. Are they different personalities, Diagus?" he forced out. "Nay, they have no separateness, no voice. As yet," Diagus thought darkly. He suspected the day might well come when they found a voice. The moment Justin had reached out, they stirred, sensing power. And for a moment, he'd had the terrible suspicion that what was in him could drain Justin, suck him dry somehow. "So it's not as if you can actually hear them?" 'Tis how I can explain this. I feel them inside me. Their knowledge is my own. Their hunger is my own. It intensifies my desire for even simple things such as food and drink. The more I feel, the more reasonable it seems to use it, and the stronger my desires become. Be myself. This thing inside of me will take over. I did not know how it would happen or what would happen to me then. I think then I'd be gone. Justin inhaled sharply. He could see a man be devoured by such a thing. My thought patterns change. They become primal, primitive. Not matters, but what I want. But you've controlled it this long. How? Justin marveled. How did a man survive such a thing in him? 'Tis more difficult here. 'Tis why I left in the first place. Why did Dad tell you to do, Justin? What did Dad tell you to do, Justin? He told me to save you, and we will. He deliberately omitted the last line of their father's letter. And if you cannot save him, you must kill him. Now he knew why. Diagus searched his gaze intently, as if not convinced that was the entirety of what Sylvan had said. Justin knew he was about to push, and he launched an offense of his own. What of the last you brought? How much does she know? Though he was amazed that Diagus could still feel anything at all with that inside him. He'd not missed the possessiveness in Diagus's gaze, or the reluctance of which he'd left her in Gwen's care. Chloe knows me as not more than a man. I approve of the water vapor helping keep it warm. So I hooked up a propane tank today. Unfortunately, the main heater does not work at all. It doesn't work at all. But the stovetop does. And one thing that I always did at the old house was we had this big pot that I would use, and I'd put oranges and cinnamon in, and we would boil it all winter long. That stove never quit. It was an electric stove, but it never quit because it was the only heat we had. The oven was left open. It was probably a fire hazard from hell, but especially in a house that was built in the 1900s. It was the original schoolhouse for Lowray. So, yeah. Anyway. One day I'll have a home again. And maybe, just maybe, I won't have to use the oven to heat it. But old habits die hard. So. She doesn't feel it in you, lucky lass, Justin thought. She senses something. She watches me strangely at times as if perplexed. And how long you'll be able to maintain the pretense? Christ, Justin, give a man a moment to catch his breath, will you? Do you plan to tell her? How? Diagus said flatly. Ugh, lass, I'm a druid from the 16th century, and I broke an oath, and now I'm possessed by the souls of 4,000-year-old evil druids. And if I do not find a way to get rid of them, I will turn into a scourge upon the earth, and the only thing that keeps me sane is trooping. What? What was that about chirping? It makes the darkness ease. When I begin to feel cold and detached for some reason, bedding a wench makes me feel human again. Naught else seems to work. Ha ha! That's why you brought her. Diagus gave him a dark look. She resists. Justin choked on a swallow of whiskey. Diagus needed trooping to keep that heinous beast at bay, yet he brought a woman with him who refused his bed? Why haven't you seduced her? He explained. I'm working on it, Diagus snarled. Justin gaped at him. Diogenes could seduce any woman. If not gently, then with a rough, wild wooing that never failed. He'd not missed the way the wee lass had looked at his brother. She needed no more than a firm nudge. So why the blither in hell hadn't Diogenes nudged? A sudden thought occurred to him. By American, she's the one, isn't she? He breathed. What one? Diogenes stalked to the tall windows, pushed the drapes aside and stared out at the night. He slid the window up and breathed deeply, greedily, of sweet, chilly Highland air. The moment I saw Gwen, a part of me simply said, mine. And from that moment, though I didn't understand it, I knew that I could do all ever to keep... I knew that I could do all ever to... It took... I knew that I would do all ever it took to keep her. 'Tis as if the druid in us recognizes our mate instantly, the one we could exchange the binding vows with. Is Chloe that one? Diogenes' head whipped around, and the unguarded, startling look on his face was answer enough for Justin. His brother had heard the same voice. Justin suddenly felt a surge of hope. Despite what he'd felt inside his brother, he knew from personal experience that oft love could accomplish miracles when all else seemed destined to fail. Diogenes may be dark, but by some miracle he wasn't lost to it yet. And when one was dealing with evil, Justin suspected love be the most potent weapon of all. And it is. Like the oranges and cinnamon, I got to go eat. Love you, mean it. Looking forward to tomorrow night. Cheers. All right, have a good night. I know you've probably been off here for a minute. I don't know. It says 39, it's 43, so yeah, probably about 10 minutes now. Right there, y'all. I'm sleepy now. Got 15 minutes left. Maybe I might get to the next chapter. Who knows? How many pages? Oh, no. Ain't gonna happen tonight. Ain't gonna happen tonight, honey. Not tonight. We still got that far left to go. Let me see how many pages. That's like 12 pages. Oh, looking forward to tomorrow night. Cheers. Awesome sauce. See you when I see you. Where was I? Whew. When Gwen joined him in the library a short time later without Chloe, Diogenes tensed. He'd yet to speak to Justin about the attempt on Chloe's life, and about the Dragar, whoever they were. Is she the one? Justin had asked. She was the one for him. Now that Justin had remarked upon it, Diogenes understood it was what he'd sensed from the very first. The kind a man kept, indeed. 'Twas no wonder he refused to use a memory spell on her and send her on her way. He was incapable of letting her go. 'Twas also no wonder he'd not been satisfied with merely trying to bed her. In this, his darkest hour, fate had gifted him with his mate. The irony of it was rich. He was a man to woo a woman under such conditions. He knew not of wooing. He knew only of seduction, of conquering. Tenderness of the heart, soft words and pledges had been burned out of him a long time ago. The youngest son of no noble consequence, pagan to boot, he'd caught too many of his youthful follies attempting to seduce his own brother. One too many of them had coyly suggested a three-way bout of love play, and not with another woman, nay, always with his own twin. Oh, that's weird. What the fuck? That just switched up. Maybe I read it wrong. Did I read that wrong? Am I not understanding this? Hold on. He learned young and learned well that he possessed one thing that a woman woman. Hence, he perfected his skills and take comfort from the knowledge that... Hold on. Even better. In his darkest hour of the fate, gifted him a mate, irony of which was how was a man to woo a woman under such conditions? He knew not of wooing. He knew only of seduction, of conquering. Tenderness of the heart, soft words and pledges had been burned out of him a long time ago. The youngest son of no noble consequence, pagan to boot, he'd caught too many of his youthful follies attempting to seduce his own brother. One too many of them had coyly suggested a three-way bout of love play, and not with another woman. Nay, always with his own twin. Okay, so other women, I totally misunderstood what the fuck that just said. Other women always wanted a three-way with him and his brother. Okay. I thought what it was saying was that he was seducing his own brother. And that was like, wait, what the fuck? What? Wait a minute. I mean, I understand back in the day, like, people had incest a lot, but damn, you know, to be putting it in a book and shit. But 4 times he'd watched Justin try to secure a wife and fail. He'd learned young and learned well that he possessed one thing that a woman wanted. Hence, he perfected his skills and taken comfort from the knowledge that while women might eschew intimacy with him, they never turned him away from their beds. He was always welcome there, even when their husband was in the next room, a fact that only deepened his cynicism involving so-called matters of the heart. Except Chloe. She was the one woman he tried to seduce that had refused him, yet remained at his side. Aye, but how long will she remain there when she discovers what you are? He had no answer for that, only a relentless determination to have all of her that he could. And if that determination was more akin to the desperation of the drowning man than a courageous one, then so be it. The night he'd tempted death and danced on the slippery terrace wall above the snow-covered city of Manhattan, and fallen to the safe side, he made a promise to himself that he would not yield to despair again. He would fight it in any way that he could, with any weapon that he could find, till the bitter end. "Where is she?" he hissed, surging to his feet. Gwen blinked. "It's wonderful to see you too, Diagus," she said sweetly. "Nice of you to drop in. We've only been waiting, forever." "Where?" "Relax. She's upstairs taking a long shower. The poor girl traveled for an entire day, and though she said that she slept a bit on the plane, she's clearly exhausted. What on earth have you been doing to her?" "I adore her, by the way," Gwen added, smiling. "She's a brainy geek like me. Now, can I have a hug?" His tension ebbed slowly, aided by the knowledge that if Chloe was safe anywhere, it was within these walls. He'd personally chiseled the protection spells into the cornerstones when the castle had been built. So long as she remained within them, no harm would find her. He skirted the sofa and opened his arms to Gwen, the woman who'd once saved his life, the woman he'd pledged his own to protect. "'Tis good to see you again, lass, and you're looking lovely as ever." He bent his head to kiss her. "No lips," Justin warned, "unless you wish me to be kissing Chloe." Diagus averted his face swiftly. "How are the wee bairnless?" he asked, with a glance at her rounded belly. Gwen beamed and prattled on about her most recent doctor's visit. When she paused finally for a breath, she peered at him intently. "Has Justin told you our idea yet?" Diagus shook his head. He was still having a hard time fathoming that Justin had known he was dark all this time. A hard time believing he was home, that his brother had welcomed him, had in fact been waiting for him. "You're my brother," Justin said quietly, and Diagus knew that he'd read his feelings in that uncanny way twins had. I would never turn my back on you. It wounds me that you thought I would. I but thought to fix it myself, Justin. You hate to ask for help. You always have. You ever shouldered more than your share of the burden. You had no right to sacrifice yourself for me. Do not even start with me. I didn't ask you to. Ugh, you'd rather be dead. Enough, Gwen snapped. Stop it, both of you. We could sit here for hours arguing about who should or who should not have done what. And what would it accomplish? Nothing. We have a problem. We'll fix it. Daigus hooked a ladder-backed chair with his foot, turned it about and dropped into it backwards, stretching his legs around the frame, resting his forearms on top of the back. He took a perverse pleasure in seeing his elder brother chastened. Justin was well met by his wee, brilliant wife. The bond betwixt them was a precocious thing. We've given this a lot of thought, Gwen said, and we think we can send someone back to warn you before the tower burns, that it's going to burn. That way you can prevent the fire, which should save Justin and keep you from ever turning dark. Daigus shook his head. Nay, lass, it wouldn't work. What do you mean? 'Tis a brilliant solution, Justin protested. Not only do now we have someone we could send, because that person might be forever stuck in the past, but I do not believe it would change me now. No, Justin, and I thought of that, Gwen insisted. If the person was one you met as a result of turning dark, like, say, Chloe, the same thing that happened to me should happen to her. She'd be sent back to her own time the moment that she succeeded in changing your future. Chloe goes nowhere without me, and she doesn't know. You didn't just tell her, did you? The tension was back again. He'd been so caught up in seeing his brother again, so relieved to be accepted, that he'd forgotten to warn Gwen to say naught of Chloe of his plight. I didn't say anything, Gwen hastened to assure him. It was apparent that she knew very little, so I kept the conversation light. We talked about college and jobs mostly. Who else have you met in this century that we might send? No one. It wouldn't work anyway. There are things you do not know. Such as? Justin probed. I'm not the same man anymore. I suspect that even if someone went back and warned the past me, and that past me didn't break his oath, what I've become would still exist in the here and now. That's impossible, she declared, with the firm conviction of a physicist having weighed her proofs both valid and true. Nay, 'tis not. I tried something very similar shortly after I broke my oath. I went back to a time before the fire, hoping to cancel myself out, to see if the past me might cause the dark me to cease to exist. The way things occurred when I took Gwen back into the past, Justin said thoughtfully. The future me ceased to exist because two identical selves couldn't coexist in the same moment in time. Even I managed to carry a note to myself through the stones, so the past me would know to move you from the tower. But the cancelling hinges on two identical selves. What are you saying? Justin demanded, hands clenching on the arms of his chair. When I went back, not only did the future me cease to exist, neither me did. I watched myself through a window for hours before fleeing again. He never disappeared. I might have strolled in and introduced myself. 'Tis wise you didn't. We must ever be wary of creating paradoxes, Justin said uneasily. Gwen gaped. That is not possible. According to the law of physics, one of you would have to cease to exist. You'd think after all she experienced with me, she wouldn't go... You'd think after all she experienced with me, she wouldn't be so hastily labeling things possible or impossible, Tristan said dryly. So, Master Jam, I'm about to kick off in about 5 minutes, bruh. I'm gonna go pick up my daughter. How could it be possible? Gwen demanded. Because I'm no longer the same man I was. I'm different enough now with these ancient beings in me that some elemental level, that past self did not conflict with who or what I've become. Oh, God, Gwen breathed. So even if we sent someone back, and they changed the past, I doubt it would ever have any effect on me at all. What I am now seems to exist beyond the natural order of things. 'Tis possible may cause some negative effects we can't even imagine. There's too much we do not understand here. I fear of creating multiple moments in time for no good purpose. Nay, my only hope is the old lore. Justin and Gwen exchanged an uneasy look. 'Twas a clever idea, Digus reassured them. I can see why you considered it. But I've been given this matter endless thought, and my only hope is to discover how they were imprisoned in the first place, and to re-imprison them. 'Tis why I came. I need to use the Kelter's library. I need to examine the ancient texts that deal with the Tuatha De Danann. "4 minutes. Justin sighed gustily and raked a hand through his hair. What? Digus' eyes narrowed. It's just that we were so certain our idea would work, Gwen said miserably. And? Digus pressed warily. Justin rose and began pacing. Digus, we no longer have those texts, he said in a low voice. Digus lunged to his feet so swiftly that the chair clattered to the floor. Nay, it couldn't be so. What? What say you? How can we not have them? He thundered. We do not know, but they're not here. After reading Dad's letter, I decided to research the Tuatha De Danann to discover all I could find about the mythic race, in hopes of discovering a way to cast them out. That's when Christopher and I found that they are missing many tombs. But surely some of the volumes I needed are here. He began naming the ones that he was specifically seeking, but as each title, Justin shook his head. That's inconceivable, Justin. Aye, and it nigh seems deliberate. Christopher and I suspect someone intentionally removed them, though we cannot discern how it might have been done. I need those texts, damn it. He slammed his fist against the paneled wall. There was a moment of silence, then Justin said slowly, There is a place, or should I say a time, they can be found. A time both you and I know our clan's library was fully extant. Digus smiled bitterly. Right. And just how was he going to explain that to Chloe? Lass, the tombs I needed aren't here, so we're going to have to go back in time and get them. He snorted. Would nothing be simple? It seemed he'd be learning more about him, whether he was ready to tell her or not. I could go for you, Justin offered, just long enough to get what we need. Then I'm going too, Gwen said instantly. Nay, Justin and Digus both snapped at the same time. Gwen glared. I will not be left behind. Neither of you will be going, Digus halted the argument before it built steam. We have no guarantee that the Tuatha De Danann didn't plant other dangers in between. Any Kelter who opens a bridge for personal reasons is at risk. No Kelter but I will be opening any bridges to another time. I'm already dark. Besides, one What one brings into the stones at one's end doesn't always show up on the other end. I lost several heirlooms when I came through last time. Gwen nodded slowly. That's true. I lost my backpack. It went spiraling off into the quantum foam somewhere. We can't risk trying to bring the books through. Can you open the stone safely? What will the use of magic do to you? Justin said cautiously. To Gwen, who hadn't been privy to their earlier conversation, he explained, when he uses magic, it makes the ancient ones stronger. Then maybe he shouldn't go, Gwen worried. Diagus exhaled dismally. All his hopes were pinned on those Kelter texts, and he'd wasted as much time as he dared. If what you say is true, and the tombs aren't here, I do not have a choice. As for their magic, I'm more concerned about what Da might do to me. I'll deal with the darkness somehow. We're clan, Diagus, Justin said softly. Da would never turn his back on you. And the timing couldn't be more fortuitous. The swinging equinox is but a few days hence. 'Tis not necessary, Diagus cut him off. I can open the stones any day, at any hour. What? Justin and Gwen exclaimed together. 'Twould seem our esteemed benefactors withheld significant portions of knowledge from us. The stones can be opened at any time, but it requires a different set of formulas. And you know these formulas, Justin pressed. Aye, but those within me do too. Their knowledge is mine. Why would such knowledge would have been withheld from us? I suspect they intended it as a deterrent to keep us Kelter from opening a breach through time rashly. One might entertain the notion, say if one brother died, to go through the stones that very day and undo it. But if one was forced to wait until the next solstice or equinox, one might have endured the worst of grief by that time, and decided against it. Diagus's voice dripped self-mockery. How long did you wait? Justin asked quietly. 3 moons, 4 days, and 11 hours. No one said anything for a time after that. Finally, Gwen shook herself and rose. While you two discuss this, I'll go prepare a room for Chloe. She sleeps with me, Diagus said in a low growl. She said you weren't sleeping together, Gwen said evenly. Christ, Gwen, what did you do? Ask her? Of course I did, Gwen replied, and she couldn't believe he'd asked such a silly question. But aside from admitting that much, she wasn't exactly forthcoming. So what is she to you? His mate, Justin said softly. Really? Gwen beamed. Oh, she clapped her hands delightedly. I'm so happy for you, Diagus. Diagus pinned her with a forbidding stare. Ugh, lass, are you witless? 'Tis not a time for celebration. Chloe doesn't ken what I am, and don't underestimate her, Diagus. We women are not as fragile as you men like to believe. Then put her in my room, he said evenly. No, Gwen said just as evenly. You will put her in my room. Gwen tipped her chin up and fisted her hands at her waist, staring him down. For a moment, Diagus was reminded of Chloe brandishing one of his own blades at him, and wondered how much we women could be so unafraid of men as he and his brother. Remarkable, but they were. No, I won't, Mr. Big, Bad, and Dark. You don't scare me, and you're not bullying me, or her, into anything that we don't want. You shouldn't just go about asking people if they're sleeping with each other, he hissed. How else was I going to know where to put her? By asking me, he glowered, and she showed no signs of budging, so he turned to Tristan for support. Tristan shrugged. My wife is lady of the castle. Don't be looking to me.
She's safe here, Diagus, Gwen said gently. I'll put the two of you across the hall from each other. She can share your room if she so chooses to. As Gwen slipped from the library, she cast a last glance over her shoulder at the two magnificent Highlanders. She was both elated and deeply troubled. Elated that Diagus had come home, but troubled as to by what yet had to come. She and Tristan had been so certain their idea would work, and they'd not thought beyond it. Now Diagus was going to have to go back into the past, open a bridge through time and search the old lore. She didn't want to let him go, and knew Tristan wouldn't either, but there wasn't much choice. She intended to try to cajole him into waiting a few days, but harbored little hope on that score.
That is temporarily the end of that. So, what do you think is going to happen? Is Chloe going to share the room? Is go back in time? Is what's going to happen next? Until next time at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, tomorrow evening, on the morrow, I bid you a good night. And until then, behave.